Hi, welcome back. So we're moving on now to question 2. Question 2 is a legitimate specimen paper from the Edexcel exam board for the new economic specification which you guys are doing. And Edexcel as an exam board has committed to the structure of questions that are in this part 2. Okay? So I apologise for the fact that some of the marks were missing from some of your papers. I don't honestly know why that happened, but I apologise, it wasn't intentional. But the structure for all these part 2s are always going to be 2A 5 marks, 2B 12 marks, 2C 8 marks, and then the essay question at the end 25 marks. So if you add 5, 12, 8, 25, that comes to 50. You'd be doing 2 of those in the 2-hour paper that you've got. So each paper will be out of 100, or rather this paper 2 will be out of 100. Anyway, let's go through it. So 2A, with reference to figure 5 and extract C, explain one likely reason for the fall in the exchange rates of the Turkish lira. A really easy question because actually the examiner's given you the answer in extract C, you just had to find it. In the mark scheme, it really does make a very clear reference that you had to actually use a quotation or use some of the figures given in the data to get an application mark. So I think we ought to use that as a rule now going forward in terms of how we answer questions. If ever it says refer or use an extract, then use a quote from the extract or use a figure from the extract. And then it's really easy. So on the one hand, you could have picked up on the fact that the emerging economies were doing very badly, or the US Federal Reserve had stopped their quantitative easing, and I think they were pushing up interest rates. I think, although it didn't ask for it, I think a diagram would have been really, really helpful for this question. It just makes everything so much easier to see as an examiner. It's like, right, they identified the right point from the data and they can apply it to an economic diagram, tick, 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 5 marks. If you haven't got a diagram, then I'm kind of looking for where the identification of the point stops and then the explanation begins. And whilst that sounds quite easy, actually in practice, marking your exams, for those of you that didn't draw the diagram, I actually found it quite hard, okay? So you're identifying the point. Are you really then explaining it in terms of economics? Are you really talking about the demand for a currency going up, putting upwards pressure on the value of that currency? Are you really talking about the supply shifting to the right and the willingness of people to sell Turkish lira increasing? And therefore driving down the price of the lira? If you draw the diagram, you kind of get rid of all of that. There's no need for any of that. The diagram says it all. So I think you're just saving yourself a lot of words and you're saving yourself the problem of does the examiner know what I'm doing or not by drawing the diagram. It's just a tip from me. 2B then. Right. Tough question actually, 2B, especially because it was a discuss question. And I don't think it's an obvious discuss question. I don't think the evaluation points are that obvious. But nevertheless, it is a discuss question. And whether you find it easy or hard, the fact that there is a command word that says discuss means that you have to do it. And for this question, it's 12 marks. And if you didn't discuss, if you didn't evaluate, if you didn't give the other half of the, to give the other side of the argument, you've limited yourself to 8. The maximum that I can give anybody with no evaluation is 8. And you've already lost a third of the marks for this one question. And that's where the vast majority of you lost a whole chunk of marks on that question simply because you didn't evaluate. Discuss the cost to the Argentine economy of an inflation rate estimated to be X, right? Don't rewrite that, by the way. Okay, you're not going to get anything for rewriting that in your answer. It doesn't make any difference. You just need to talk about the costs of inflation. So some of the obvious costs to me of inflation would be, first of all, that it makes your exports uncompetitive. Now, what you can do really good here is you can apply, because you've got to apply it. It's asked you about the Argentine economy. So I'd be tempted to say, look, looking from the text, Argentina is a country that's very heavily dependent on its exports, in particular beef and soya. If there's inflation, the prices of these products are going to go up. That's going to make them uncompetitive on world markets, and therefore the exports are going to fall, and therefore that's going to drive AD backwards in the Argentine economy. Now, I fail to see how an examiner couldn't give you at least 4 marks for that point. You know, you've got application, you've got knowledge, and you've got analysis. Yeah, you've answered the question. How does it affect the Argentine economy? Some of you talked about good stuff. In fact, some of you talked about how it would affect people's living standards, how it would hit the poorest hardest because they're the ones that don't have any savings, so they can't adjust for increases in price. A lot of you talked about the wage price spiral, how actually inflation breeds inflation. Yeah, if prices go up, people ask for higher wages. If wages go up, then prices get any higher. One or two of you, not many, brought up the things like menu costs and shoe leather costs. Inflation can lead to capital flight. Inflation can lead to emigration if it's really high. The one thing, and I think I'm going to have to do this with you in class, the one thing that I feel nervous about is saying that inflation reduces consumption. I mean, just think about that for a minute. If prices were going up all around you, if you knew that prices were going up tomorrow of your food, then what would you do with your money today? The answer is you'd spend it. You'd spend all your money today because tomorrow it's going to be more expensive. So if you spend it today, you'll get more for your money. And this is true of countries that suffer from hyperinflation. People don't save their money, okay, because saving your money would be massively disadvantageous because inflation erodes the value of your savings. Yeah, you put your money in the bank account, it's worth X. By the time you take it out, it doesn't buy you anything half as much as what it did before. So people spend more money when there is inflation. It doesn't decrease aggregate demand. Aggregate demand certainly does not shift to the left because of inflation. If anything, it increases people's consumption. It makes people more willing to spend their money because they don't want to wait for tomorrow when the prices are higher. So I'm afraid if you did make that point, and there were quite a lot of you that made that point, it's not true. And I know it feels a bit counterintuitive in a way, but I think you have to just think about that idea that if prices go up tomorrow, I'll spend my money now, I'll spend my money today. I'm not going to wait till it goes up tomorrow. That would be illogical. Then the really tough bit about this question, or the harder part of this question rather, is just the discussion. So actually, is it that bad? Or, are the costs really that great? So I think in this sense, you've got to try and find a couple of reasons why actually inflation might not be that bad for Argentina. So obvious things that spring to mind might be, well, if it's only temporary, then it's bad for a short period of time. But as long as prices go back down relatively quickly, then we can all sort of get along and everything can be all right. It depends on the elasticity of our exports, because I made the point earlier that if exports go up in price, then they become uncompetitive and people don't buy them. Well, if they're very inelastic, then actually people will continue to buy them. We might see a small fall in the quantity demanded, but not very much, and therefore actually the revenue that we get in a country might actually increase. Inflation can actually be a good thing for people who have lots of debt because inflation essentially erodes the value of debt. So it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's not a really obvious point. Actually, none of those are obvious points. But just because they're not obvious doesn't mean you ought not to try and engage with that part of the question. I would suspect, I don't know, but I would suspect that not many people would be picking up very many evaluative marks there. So if you can do something, even if you don't get the 4 evaluative marks, even if you only got 2 of them, that's 2 more marks than I think most people would get. And that's kind of the way you have to play the game. A lot of people don't like hearing that, which is because a lot of people think, well, sometimes it's not worth answering a question unless you're going to get 4 marks. But it's actually rubbish. You need all the marks you can get. And if you can get 2 out of the 4 evaluation marks, like I say, that's better than the person who gets 0 out of 4 for the evaluation marks. So try and do it as best you can. You've really got no idea what the examiner's going to think as he's marking your script or she's marking your script. They might look favourably on the fact that you actually attempted an evaluation. They might think that it makes more sense than you do, and credit it more than you think they might. But unless you actually engage with the idea of having an evaluation, then you won't get any evaluative marks whatsoever. Anyway, I'll move on. Part C. Really didn't like this question because I think the answer's basically in the data. Examine is a command word for give 2 sides to the argument. So it's a bit like discuss, it's a bit like evaluate. Okay, examine means evaluate. The impact of restrictions on beef exports on how Argentine farmers decide to use their land. Well, as I say, the answer's kind of in the text. Beef exports went down because the Argentinian government put export restrictions on them. The price was going up. They felt like consumers were being exploited, so they put price restrictions there, and all the revenue that the Argentinian beef farmers were expecting to get suddenly disappeared. They weren't getting as much as they thought they were going to get. So as a result of that, they all thought, stuff this, we're going to make soy. And the reason we're going to make soy is because the Chinese, there's a lot of demand from China because of this. Right. As far as I can work out from the mark scheme, if you did all of that, that's 6 marks. You have told me that there are restrictions on beef imports. You've told me why. You've told me what the Argentinian farmers did about that. And you hopefully gave me some reference to extractee, either a quote or a figure, and that's 6 marks. A lot of you didn't get past 6 marks, and I bet you can guess the reason why. Because you didn't evaluate. You didn't tell me, you didn't discuss how Argentinian farmers, all the sorts of decisions, the sorts of things that Argentinian farmers were thinking about when they decided to move their land. I've got to, as I say, I'm not a big fan of this question, but you had to do something like, not all Argentinian farmers will do this. And the reason they may not do this is because some of them are still probably making enough money from beef exports despite the restrictions. Some of them might not do it because they don't believe that the demand for soy from China is going to last long enough. Some of them simply might not have the resources to make soy because their resources are conducive to raising cattle, but they're not conducive to planting soybeans. Again, I'm not saying I find that question particularly easy. When I first read it, I think I was struggling to think what I would do for evaluative points. But as I said in the previous question, you've got to try and do it. You've got to try and do something. If you don't do it, the maximum I can give you is 6. And again, you've already lost 2 marks simply by not engaging with that part of the question. Right, the last question then was about the devaluation. Now look, you can, if you look at that, if you look at those 2 questions again, you can see a pattern. Edexcel has committed, I think, to this sort of question, which is about the likely micro and macroeconomic effects of X, whatever X is. So that's why I've given you those sorts of questions in the past, and you'll continue to get them, and that's the sort of thing that you need to be practicing when you're eventually looking at your revision for the summer. Here's a policy. How does this impact on at a micro and macro level? By micro level, we just mean supply and demand diagrams for any given market. So the obvious ones to choose here might be a beef market or a soy market. I'm not saying you had to draw the diagrams. I'm just saying you just need to think about particular products and particular markets. And then on the macro level, you need to think about the macro objectives. You guys pretty much did this question in the weeks leading up to into Christmas. So if I'm honest, I was expecting a bit better. But I think some of you've got a bit of work to do, we've got a bit of revision to do on devaluations and what it means. So here's a few points that you could have had. Okay, devaluation of the Argentinian peso. So on the one hand, this is very good because suddenly exports become more competitive. Hopefully more exports will be sold and that will improve the trade balance in Argentina. You could apply it more to Argentina and talk about particularly soy, particularly beef. On the other hand, it's going to be quite bad for cost push inflation because imports are now more expensive, and if Argentinian businesses are importing any raw materials or any component parts for their production process, this is all going to cost more, and so you might get cost push inflation. Diagram. Put a diagram in. Put the diagram in of AD shifting to the right because of exports. Put the diagram in for cost push inflation and the AS curve shifting upwards because imports are more expensive. Then there's a really obvious evaluation, and we did this, as I say, in like last few lessons before Christmas, which is the Marshall-Lerner condition, the J curve. So this all depends on the relative elasticities of your exports and your imports. And in the short run, it's likely to get worse because your businesses are likely to be locked into long-term contracts. People's price elasticity of demand for imports is relatively inelastic because they don't change their spending habits very quickly. And therefore, actually, the trade balance is likely to deteriorate in the short run before it gets better. Draw the curve, explain the curve, and there's a really good evaluation point over there. Other things you could have talked about, I would be tempted to talk about things like unemployment. Again, from an exporting point of view, if we're exporting more, then that will create jobs in exporting industries, and therefore more people will be employed. That will contribute to GDP growth. That will also have an impact on the government, the fiscal budget. The government will have to spend less on welfare and get more in tax revenue from income taxes. You could talk about how the increasing price of imports, although it's inflationary, there will be some more government tax revenue coming from import tax, at least in the short term, whilst elasticity is still relatively inelastic for imports. And there's a whole load of points that we could talk about. If you look in your textbook, I'm sure it'll give you a bullet point list of here are the impacts of a devaluation of the economy. Keep going with this. It's a 25-mark essay. There's loads and loads of marks available for this. I would say if you're only writing a page and a couple of lines at the end, onto a second page, you're not writing anywhere near as enough. You need to be writing, I think, 2 pages, probably 3 pages for this. It's 25 marks. There's a hell of a lot of marks going begging here. And as an examiner, I'm looking for things. I'm looking for things all the way through. There's no negative marking, and for some of your paragraphs, you're writing a lot, and some of your paragraphs aren't hitting. And you probably didn't realise it at the time. At the time, you probably thought you were writing a brilliant point that had loads of value. But actually, that whole paragraph, that whole kind of 4 minutes of writing didn't get you anything. So the point I'm trying to make is, the more you write, it matters less if a couple of your paragraphs are wrong or you went down a rabbit hole or something like that. Because actually you can make the marks back up with later paragraphs. If, on the other hand, you only wrote 3 paragraphs and one of them's wrong and the other one's a bit iffy, then actually I've only got 1 paragraph and a half that I can give you credit for out of 25 marks. That's really not very many. You're going to be in single figures, and that's going to have a massive impact on your grade, because if you get the essay bit wrong, let's say you only get 6 out of 25, that could be a grade. That sort of, losing 19 marks at that point, that could be a grade. So you can't really afford to get these essays wrong. And one way you can mitigate that is just by writing lots. So if you run out of time doing the essay, then you need to think about your time management when it comes to the summer. You might want to start with the essays first. it's people always, well, a lot of people don't like me saying that because it feels very uncomfortable. It feels very unnatural doing the essays first. But if you do the essays first, let's say you did both essays first, at least you would know that you have answered 50% of the paper. Yeah, 2 essays are 50% of the paper. If, on the other hand, you do all the rest, you get through all the rest of the exam, but you don't quite get onto the essay, geez, you've already lost 25% of the marks. It doesn't matter how good the rest of it was, you can only have possibly got 75%. So something you might want to think about if you're struggling with the time management, because I didn't know if some of you had ran out of time or you just didn't have a lot to say, but you can't really afford to only write a couple of paragraphs for an essay. It's a terrible exam technique. It's not going to do you any favours in the summer. Right, that's it in terms of feedback then for the paper. If you have any more outstanding questions, please come and talk to me. Either come and talk to me in the office or find me at a revision clinic. I'm going to start ramping up the number of revision clinics that we do, so I'm going to hopefully be offering 3 a week during the lunch times. So come and find me and we'll go through it. Okay? Cheers.